Hello, today we'll be presenting on Decolonizing the Canon with open education resources and great books. On behalf of my colleagues, Ilse Schreinemakers, Allison Cimino, and myself, Susan Lago, we welcome you. This presentation shares a community college composition curriculum that decolonizes the canon, an open education OER, Great Books initiative that is inclusive of LGBT, racism, feminism, and environmentalism. Planning for this initiative started in spring 2017 with 4 members of our ad hoc committee who developed course materials and syllabi that included readings by Sappho, W.E.B. Du Bois, Mary Wollstonecraft, and Henry David Thoreau. In spring 2019, we received a state OER scale-up grant to develop our materials into an OER format, which would allow participating courses to receive a zero textbook cost designation. CUNY Queensborough Community College's diverse population of students who already entered the composition classroom with a range of experiences specific to their own intersecting identities now have an opportunity to see those identities reflected in rigorous texts that include them in a wider academic discourse. This opportunity is especially important in a time when universities across the world have had to move from face-to-face instruction to distance learning. As learners and faculty struggle with digital literacy as well as access to the technological tools they need for online instruction, this initiative can be integrated into a course's online interface at no cost to the learner. Thus, while this curriculum challenges learners with its vocabulary and ideas, it also serves a diverse, multicultural student population by fostering learning opportunities that help learners think critically about timeless issues while improving their reading and writing skills. We found in our committee work that there's a need for faculty resources, including things like lesson plans and PowerPoints. We also took into consideration critical pedagogies advanced by Paulo Freire, bell hooks, and Inoue. In his book, Anti-Racist Writing Assessment Ecologies, Inoue asks a question. As a teacher, if you notice that 16 out of the 20 students in your writing course were failing their essays, wouldn't you re-examine your assignment or expectations or how you judged essays? His answer is that classroom promotes one discourse alongside other non-dominant ones, and the non-dominant ones become the way toward critical examination, toward critical assessment practices. Bell hooks addresses the issue from another standpoint, where she finds that critical pedagogy encompasses all the areas of study that aim to redress biases that have informed ways of teaching and knowing in our society ever since the first public schools opened. The 2 great movements for social justice in our nation that both changed all aspects of our culture and created small but powerful revolutions in education are the civil rights and feminist movements. Bell hooks also makes the point that college professors have tremendous freedom in the classroom. Our major difficulty is sharing knowledge from an unbiased and/or decolonized standpoint with students who are so deeply mired in dominator culture that they are not open to learning new ways of thinking and knowing. This is something recognized by Paulo Freire, who says, to surmount the situation of oppression, people must first critically recognize its causes so that through transforming action, they can create a new situation, one which makes possible the pursuit of a fuller humanity. To address these issues, we developed an open resource curriculum that would introduce learners to early thinkers and critics, such as Mary Wollstonecraft. Yes, her text is challenging for first-year writers to understand, but through writing to learn and classroom discussion, they come to an understanding of her assertion that men have submitted to superior strength to enjoy with impunity the pleasure of the moment. Women have only done the same. Therefore, till it is proved that the courtier who servilely resigns the birthright of man is not a moral agent, it cannot be demonstrated that woman is essentially inferior to man because she has always been subjugated. And this is an idea that they can really understand. I find when I teach Wollstonecraft that by pairing it with contemporary texts such as Bad Feminists by Roxane Gay, that it makes her more old-fashioned vocabulary a little bit more accessible for students. A lesson plan that contextualizes the feminist movement and feminist critical theory also helps students to understand the different modes of thinking. And we can do this through a scaffolded lesson plan. I have students do a multimodal project, which allows them to express themselves on many different levels, addressing timeless questions such as, what is a feminist? Are you a feminist? After our pilot year, we had some reflections, which is that the vocabulary was difficult for students, which did result in some resistance on their part, but that we could help them as their instructors over this lack of historical context and cultural differences. And through this, we ourselves gained new insight and looked for new ways to address a variety of learning styles. Students at the end of this project felt a great deal of pride in their creative efforts.
Thank you, Susan. I'm Allison Cimino, and I taught English Composition 2 to first-year college students. In the introduction to her translations of Sappho's poems, If Not Winter, poet and translator Anne Carson writes of the mystery and debate that has followed Sappho throughout the centuries. She says, quote, controversies about her personal ethics and way of life have taken up a lot of time throughout the history of Sapphic scholarship. It seems that she knew and loved women as deeply as she did music. Can we leave the matter there? End quote. I appreciate sharing this quote and Carson's sentiment when teaching Sappho to first-year college composition students. On the one hand, it signals to students that here is a writer from antiquity who was a self-possessed woman who loved women deeply and intimately. Yet the quote also adds a contemporary layer of, so what? To students who may come from traditional backgrounds where sexuality is repressed, the information indicates that same-sex love has been around since antiquity. It also moves us beyond the sexual orientation of Sappho towards the real treasure, her poems. In teaching Sappho, there's the benefit of exploring the work of the unfinished and comparing the art of translation. Additionally, Sappho straddles two worlds in academia, the connection to the classical era and to modernity. As a poet who has been recently translated and embraced by contemporary poets in the English language, her poems are timeless, demonstrating humanist meaning and music. Next slide, please. In reading Sappho's poems and engaging with them through poetry, students learn to appreciate poetry through the act of writing it and reading it as writers. Prior to writing about the poems in an essay for English Composition 2, students appropriated fragments by Sappho as a starting off point for their own poems. Additionally, students were encouraged to play with the brackets and space in Sappho's poems and imagine their own poetic versions of her poems. By interacting with the poems, as mentioned earlier, students embark on, quote, the adventure of critical thinking, as Bell Hooks writes in Teaching Critical Thinking. By students interacting with the poems, both analytically through discussion and writing essays, and creatively through writing creative poems, students remove any barriers the text may hold by its nature of being a classic text. The process of engaging with the poems creatively also emboldens students to explore their own minds. Next slide, please. When we read Sappho, we look at the original text as well as copies of the pages of the papyrus where the fragments have been originally located, as seen in this slide to the left. We discuss both the intentional line breaks and the space, as well as the brackets that Carson uses in her translation to indicate what is missing due to the text being damaged and missing pages. With the brackets, students are invited to consider what might have been included in the original poem, as well as imagine what they would write in its place. A benefit to discussing Sappho with students is also comparing the translations, as there are many available on the internet. In class, we discussed the difference a few words make as seen in these two translations. The benefit of such a short poem is that it distills the experience. Students note the contemporary wording and emphasis of I say here in the Carson translation. They are also sensitive to the contrast of men versus someone in the translation. So men here has the antiquity translation and Carson saying someone. There's a genderless neutral translation. Carson's translation also demonstrates how line breaks play into the creation and discussion of poetry and the decolonization of language. Additionally, there's the specific mention of time as opposed to hereafter, and students observe how one word evokes a world of connection to time and timelessness. Next slide, please. So the discussion of word choice and wording and the omission of words supports students' understanding of composition writing. Finally, students respond to the poems in an essay. After responding in an essay, they are invited to write their own original poems inspired by contemporary poets. We read Audre Lorde, Sherman Alexie, Joy Harjo, and other contemporary writers, and the poetry prompt includes this directive: write a poem of witness using your own life or an event happening today. Reading and writing their own lines of poetry supports student composition writing as well as their comprehension and appreciation of poetry. Thank you. Ilsa?
Thank you, Allison. I am Ilsa Schreinemakers, and today I'd like to share some of the strategies that have worked for me for integrating a challenging text, W.E.B. Du Bois's Souls of Black Folk, into a first composition program. I'd like to frame my discussion as being prompted by an educational objective for first-year college students to realize their potential to engage critically with core, historical, often unread texts. By working through the challenging images, dated references, and perhaps unfamiliar vocabulary, my diverse learners can gain an understanding of the long struggle for civil and human rights while sharpening their critical reading, writing, and thinking skills. Next slide, please. So I begin the classroom experience of diving into Du Bois with a simple prompt to explore the meaning of the title. Many students will share religious connections, of course, but view the title as a personal statement only, one that is a matter of interpretation. This is a good starting point for analysis as students work through the course with how meaning gets created, the role of definition in creating meaning, and the many factors that may or may not align to produce that definition. Next slide, please. I thereby share with my students the much larger picture of what compelled Du Bois to pick up the pen. This larger picture begins the process for students to engage with the process of comprehending connection struggles between the personal and historical, the individual and societal cultural values. The one cannot be necessarily separated so easily from the other, and that as first-year college students, they are in the process of learning how to communicate, contemplate these intersections and connections. Next slide, please. We then explore the meaning being communicated in artifacts from the Jim Crow era, which I show on the next slide. Next slide, please. These are just a sample of a few that have been especially powerful to my students, especially those that may not have been educated in the American school system or for those whom this history may be brand new. Next slide, please. Next, since Soul of Black Folk is such a challenging text, I tend to have most success with requiring the reading of spiritual strivings and focusing students' attention on two key concepts. I first draw their attention to these concepts by mandating journal entry that puts these ideas into focus. So you can see that before reading, I have them consider how others perceive you. Sometimes this perception lifts us up, sometimes it does not. And that Du Bois centers on how he felt the double consciousness in a veil, in other words, societal barriers. And then while reading, I have them take notes about especially poignant passages, two of which I'll share in a moment, and what words or images stand out for you, why, what passages might be challenging, why, and what are two passages that really stay with you, what conflicts are being discussed, and how do we interpret their cause and effect relationship. Next slide, please. These slides share some of the key quotations that prompt students' critical thinking, reading, and writing. On the left here, I have highlighting the quotes that handle specifically with double consciousness, with what students work through the vocabulary and the references and the images really strikes a chord with them. And then on the right, we have the where Du Bois famously discusses the veil. And for many students, once they make that connection about the power of that concrete image, what he means by it works really well too. Next slide, please. At the same time, as students are working through the text, I require them to frame a thoughtful description discussion of how the term identity gets defined in the context of their immediate lives. This pairing of the journal writing with this writing assignment that you see here on this slide eventually produces connections for students between historical struggles and their individual situations, but in a way that doesn't demand that there be a connection, as long as students are critically assessing and expressing the complexities of the process of definition in the world of Du Bois and in their own. And so you can see here, I've scaffolded the assignment to be kind of on the short side, 3-paragraph assignment. First, to think about a word or phrase that describes how you view yourself. Secondly, a word or phrase that others might use in their views of you. And then to compare and contrast those descriptions to reach a definition of identity. And that pairs really well with the discussion of double consciousness as well as the veil. So they're working on these two assignments alongside each other. Next slide. So finally, I'd like to share a bit about the platform that we used and created for our students, as well as other faculty, which was especially useful during the semesters of remote learning. We created an OER textbook using the platform Manifold. And we gave our students access to free e-publications of the text, as well as to tools to engage directly within the text and with each other, to create that dialogue that my colleague Susan Lago spoke about earlier, to have a partnership. And so what we have here is, I'm going to give you a brief virtual tour of the actual OER that our students and other faculty within CUNY have access to. This first is the opening page of our textbook, which gives an overview of the text that we're discussing. We've shared a mission statement for faculty, but we've also put together a student forward, keeping in mind that they're first year, most of them are first year composition students, and that we're on their side. And we shared some of the concerns they might have about reading challenging text in their first year of college. Next, you'll see how we've provided the e-publications for each of the texts and grouping them according to the isms. All students will have access and faculty to educational resources related to the authors if they want to continue their study or to supplement the study that they're currently doing. This includes PowerPoints, lesson plans, access to contemporary readings that pair really well with the classic texts. We've also put together web resources for the great books so students can explore and see for themselves historical documents, exhibit resources, and additional biographical information. Thank you. It was a pleasure sharing all of this with you.